Hey everyone, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome back to the It's Attainable Real Estate Investing Show. Is it episode number 8? In today's show, we're going to talk about residential property asset types and what to look for in them. Who, what, why, when, and where. Let's hit it.
Welcome to the It's Attainable Real Estate Investing Show, where you will learn about investing, the power of real estate investing, and how to invest in it. Whether you have the time or even if you don't, you're going to see it's attainable either way. And now your host, who always wants to share knowledge with you, Christopher Balcom.
So residential property asset types and what to look for in them. We're going to start out with the why. I said the who, what, why, when, and where, the 5W's. So let's start out with the why. Well, residential property assets or residential property real estate is tried and true. I mean, people need a place to live. CBRE, which is the world's largest commercial real estate services and investment firm, their chairman of American Research and senior economic advisor, he just stated, like as it relates to COVID-19, as commercial real estate copes with the ramifications of COVID-19, collections of April rent for office, industrial, and multifamily came in around 90%. So that means that the lessees or the tenants paid around 90% in collections, from his research, from their research. And for retail, it came in around 20 to 40%. That's below half of rent or lease contract expectations. So people need a place to live. So when you think about the priorities of an individual or a family, first is going to be your well-being, your health, and then you're going to need a place to stay. So again, I say people need a place to live, but like anything, when you provide a service or a product that people actually need and use, it's not necessarily a luxury. People like need it. That's going to be a priority to them. And if it's something that costs, then that's going to be pretty close to the top of the charts when it comes to taking care of yourself and taking care of your family. Firstly, health and your well-being, and then probably secondly is a roof over your head. So residential property, that asset type or that asset class for real estate, it provides exactly that. So that's the why. So who, what, why, when, and where? We start out with the why, and that is the why. It is just tried, true, and it matches the need of people. All right, so what about the what? The what? All right, the what is the type of property. It's what we're talking about here. So what type of residential property asset? Well, there's single family homes. There's multi-family apartment buildings. There's different tiers to those and different classes as well. So what about the single family home? What is that? So a single family home is typically a house, a single house for a single individual or family to live in. So if I'm buying a place for my family to stay and I get a mortgage, I want to own it at one point, that's a single family home. So it's just saying that a single family is going to occupy this home versus multifamily, which means multiple families or people are going to live or occupy that structure. So I want to show here the differences between these residential property asset types. I'm not going to go into the details about how buy and hold real estate investing work, because the last 4 shows, which turned into a series, I've talked about and we've discussed here how buy and hold real estate investment work in detail. But it's just a quick summary. You, the investor or the owner, enter into a lease agreement with the tenant, and you, the investor or owner, provide the tenant a place to occupy. In return, the tenant pays an agreed upon amount for rental or lease payments. Now, I keep stressing the point that you need to provide the tenants a good place to occupy. If it's residential, like what we're talking about today, then you should provide the tenants a good place to be, a good place to live. If it's industrial or restaurants or some other type of commercial asset type like retail, then you also need to provide the tenants the need that they're looking for. So it still needs to be a good place for them to occupy in return for the tenant holding up their part of the agreement and paying their rental payments or lease payments. Okay, so back to the single family home. Okay, so when it comes to purchasing the single family home, it can be pretty competitive because There's two classes of people looking for it. There's the buyers of people who want to occupy the home, and then there's the investors, people who want to buy the home to provide it as a rental or a lease to others who want to occupy the home. So there's two different classes of people looking for the same home, the same property. So it can be pretty competitive, especially in some areas where there's a shortage of affordable housing. As the economy grows and grows and the housing market and real estate market grows and grows, homes can get more and more expensive, and the supply can't keep up with the demand, and that usually drives the supply to increase in price. So it can be very competitive for some of those reasons. Now, on the flip side, when it comes to selling that single family home at some point in the future, ideally it could still be a competitive market. So that's a good thing for the seller. If the economy is still going well and housing market is still increasing in price, typically the time to sell that home could be drastically decreased, and you could get a ideal price that you're looking to sell it for. Ideally, a higher price than what it was that you purchased a single family home for. We know that from previous shows is called appreciation, probably natural appreciation in those cases where the economy is just rising and the housing market is rising and supply and demand is causing the appreciation or the real estate asset to increase. But anyhow, when it comes time to sell the single family home, or you decide to sell the single family home as the investor, you have a large base of people to sell it to, because again, you have the people who want to buy the home to live in, and then you may have the investors who want to buy the home to provide a lease or rental to others who want to occupy it. Now, for the investor, a couple of things to be aware of or have at least some concern about. As single-family homes rise in price due to, again, supply and demand or other economic metrics or reasons, you have to make sure you're analyzing properly and carefully to ensure that the single-family home can still be profitable from a cash flow perspective. We talked about in some of the recent shows the different opportunities for income from buying whole real estate, and one of those is cash flow. But as the cost of the single family home increases, the price that you purchased it at, you have to make sure that the rental market can support that and still pay all your expenses. Otherwise, you may be entering into an agreement to own a liability versus entering into an agreement to invest in an asset. And we definitely don't want that. We didn't start investing to add another bill to our life. So you have to be careful there. We're going to talk about analyzing assets in an upcoming show, so stay tuned and you'll be well prepared. Now, one other thing. It's a single person or a single family occupying that home. So when there's vacancy, or once that tenant leaves, that person or that family leaves, all the expenses immediately fall back to you, the investor or the owner, or any reserves that you may have had set aside for vacancy. All the expenses immediately shift to you, the investor, or those reserves. So there's no one else to pay those expenses except for you or the reserves you have set aside, because there's just one tenant. Okay, so one last thing and we'll move on from single family homes. How is it valued? You probably shouldn't buy too many things in life without knowing how it's determined of what the value of what you're purchasing is. So it's important for whatever you're purchasing to know initially if it's a good value, if you're purchasing it at a competitive price. And then when it comes to real estate, when you go to sell it, it's important to know how you can determine or control the value of the asset or the property when you go to sell it. So how are single family homes valued? The part you can control in valuing and controlling the value of your single family home, whether you occupy the home yourself or an investor, is going to be based on maintaining the home appropriately, so staying up on any type of interior or exterior maintenance, and then finishes, so interior and exterior finishes. Single family homes are based on the sales comparison approach. There's different approaches that an appraiser can use when it comes to valuing property or homes. And single family homes are based on the sales comparison approach. What does that mean? It means that your single family home that you live in or occupy, or that you invest in for others to occupy, is going to be based on the value of the surrounding homes or properties around it. Assuming that your single family home is in line with the surrounding properties that have been bought and sold in terms of maintenance, interior finishes, and exterior finishes. So for example, if your home is 3 bedrooms and 2 baths, and surrounding homes that are being sold and bought are 3 bedrooms and 2 baths for $200,000, then your home is going to be similarly valued. Again, assuming interior and exterior finishes are similar, such as exterior siding and surfaces, and interior finishes such as faucets and countertop and flooring and walls and such are of similar finish. So you may wonder, like I wondered, well, if I'm an investor and I'm getting a certain rent amount for the home, doesn't that count into the value? The answer is a big no, it doesn't. You see, when you sell the home, recall it can be purchased by another investor like yourself or a family who wants to live there. The family who wants to live there, they could care less about how much you previously rented the home for because they're not going to rent it, they're going to live there. So the appraiser just has to use one approach, and it's been chosen, and that's the sales comparison approach that we've been talking about here. Now, there is a residential asset type that more likely is going to be purchased by an investor than it is someone who wants to live there. More times than not, at least. That asset type is multifamily apartments. And we're going to separate multifamily apartments into 2 classes, 2 to 4 units and 5 to infinity units. And units are apartments or apartment homes or apartment units. So when I say units, we're talking about individual apartments within the same building or property line. So with 2 to 4 unit apartment buildings or structures, you start to weed out the potential buyers because a single person or a single family probably isn't going to buy a 2 to 4 unit apartment building when they only need 1 unit to live in, right? Well, that's mostly right. It's mostly right because there's a very, very, very valuable scenario to a single person or a small family who wants to live in 1 unit and maybe rent out the rest and live maybe rent-free. Typically, your biggest expense is your living expense. Where you live is going to cost you the most of your income. So if you can live rent-free, that's a great thing, right? Well, that's going to be a whole nother show. Another example of how powerful real estate can be, but not for this show. But it is coming. There's so many facets to real estate to where you can take it or it can take you. My mind wanders sometime and I just get off topic. But let me get back on topic. Multifamily apartments, 2 to 4 units. Okay, I was saying that when it comes to buying or purchasing multifamily apartments, 2 to 4 units, there's a bit less competition. The people who want to live or occupy the home or the unit or the property, they're not looking for 2 to 4 units. They're just looking for 1 unit. So they're either going to be renting a unit or the apartment, but when it comes to purchasing, they're probably just going to buy a single family home. So there's less competition when it comes to purchasing because the pool of buyers is going to be mostly investors like yourself. Is that a good thing? Well, maybe. Because of supply and demand, like anything, if there's less demand and there's more supply, then ideally the price could be pretty good. It's not always the case here with multifamily apartments because there's not always a lot of supply either. So there's less demand, but there is also less supply at times. But there's other times where I see good opportunities to purchase multifamily apartments. Those opportunities sit there for a long time. And I'm sure the sellers of those apartments or those assets, they don't know why. And I don't know why either in all cases, but at least in some cases, I can tell you that from my discussions with peers who are also investors, some are afraid or don't know what they don't know about multifamily apartments. So they don't invest in them. They just invest in single family homes. It makes sense. And when it comes to multifamily apartments, they haven't taken the plunge into that residential asset type yet. Some because they don't want to, and some because they don't need to. Recall in prior shows that I talked about your goals being what will drive you. So if you can reach your goals with single family homes, then that is perfectly fine. And if you need to invest in another asset class, such as multifamily apartments or industrial or retail, then that is perfectly fine too. Achieving your goals for yourself or your family are one of the most important things for real estate investing. I will say that at a high level, most people understand the foundation or the structure of a single family home. Conceptually, it's just a single structure. There's a family and there's a furnace, there's a roof, there's a utility bill for each of the types of utilities, electric, gas, water. It's pretty simplified conceptually. So I get it that a single family home, high level, just seems like it is totally understood by most how that works. When it comes to multifamily, there are many more things to think about, like we've talked about in some of the shows when we talk about the different types of expenses and utilities and the management or oversight that may be required for some of those type of things. I get it. It is a learning curve, but don't be afraid. You can do it. And for those of you listening to this show, whether you haven't started yet or whether you're a beginner or whether you've been doing this a long time, you're going to learn a lot here about multifamily apartments and how to invest in them correctly and successfully, because I've got firsthand knowledge in it. That's one of the asset types that I invest in. And reach out to me. I'm laughing because for those that are close to me, they know that I certainly don't mind talking about this stuff. So with multifamily apartments, 2 to 4 units, there's less competition than there are for single family home purchases. So with single family homes, I talked about how they're valued. So how are multifamily apartments valued? Well, the 2 to 4 unit variety or 2 to 4 unit asset type of multifamily apartments are also valued based on the sales comparison approach, just like single family homes. So you might wonder, also like I did, well, why is that the case? I mean, 2 to 4 units, ideally it's going to be a rental property. You're not going to have one family probably occupy all 4 units. Why would it be based on the sales comparison approach? Well, just like with single family homes, that's just the way it is. It's been determined already that the sales comparison approach is what will be used in valuing multifamily apartments 2 to 4 units. Now, since the buyers of multifamily apartments mostly will be investors, the investors are you yourself. You care about the rental income and potential income and expenses related to the multifamily asset. And those things matter when it comes to the cash flow, one of the income opportunities for buy and hold real estate. But if there's a bank involved, the bank is going to want the value of the property that does not include rental income. So the appraiser is going to use the sales comparison approach, and it's not based on rental income or expenses and things of that nature. It's going to be based on, just like single family homes are, similar properties, similar property types, built in similar time periods, with similar amenities or similar finishes, and ideally properties that have been similarly maintained. So I stated with a single family home, it's exactly that. It is a single family or a person that lives in that home. So when that tenant leaves, all the expenses fall back to the investor or the investor's reserves that they had set aside in case of vacancy. So that means the utilities, if they need to be kept on or maintained, the mortgage, if there is one, all those things, including that there is no more income when the tenant leaves, all those things transfer over to the investor or the owner when that tenant leaves. Now, ideally, the investor or the owner or the property management staff that the investor has in place will get the single family home made ready for a new single person or family to move into as soon as possible. But it still takes time. So how do you mitigate this loss of income and immediate expense that transfers over to the investor? We know people aren't going to stay forever. With a single family home, ideally families will live there, so they may stay more than the typical single person because they have a family, maybe they have children, and children are tied to schools potentially depending on the area, so they may stay longer than most, but they may not stay forever. So how do you mitigate this risk? Well, I keep mentioning that the expenses will immediately transfer over to the investor or owner or their reserves. So the investor or owner should have set aside reserves for a certain amount of vacancy so that you can cover the expenses such as utilities being maintained and mortgage payments being made and any other expenses that the single family home might have. But how else do you mitigate this risk? I mean, you went from collecting a monthly rental payment to collecting zero. Well, multifamily. So multifamily spreads that risk. We talked about there being a single person or a single family paying the lease. Multifamily, we've gotten to 2 to 4 units, right? So we don't have just one person or family paying the rent. We have 4 people or 4 families paying you rental or lease income. So that in itself natively spreads the risk for the investor or for the owner. If one tenant moves out, your expenses, ideally, if you buy it right, and we're going to talk about analyzing in the future show, right? But if you buy it right, ideally, your vacancy from one unit should not make the asset become a liability. It should not transfer over all the expenses to the investor or the owner. You may see a dip in the cash flow or in the income stream, but at least it didn't become a liability and you're having to pull from your reserves or you're having to pull from your own personal pocket just to pay the bills. And even for multifamily, I mentioned reserves. You're going to have reserves for multifamily too. So you spread the risk by having more units or more families there to pay their lease in case there is a vacancy of one or more units, but you also will still maintain adequate reserves, which again, we're going to talk about how to analyze buying a property in the future show. So stay tuned and you'll learn how to set aside the appropriate amount of vacancy reserves from the income that you receive from your lease and rental payments. So in terms of the what category, the who, what, why, when, and where, in terms of the what category or the type of residential asset type or the type of property, we talked about single family homes and we started talking about multifamily apartments, 2 to 4 units. So what about 5 units and beyond, or 5 units to infinity, as I said? So you can imagine when we compare single family and multifamily 2 to 4 units, each time we went up in the amount of families or the structure or the amount of people who occupy the unit, it seems like the amount of potential buyers for those assets or those properties went down. So continuing that trend, with multifamily apartments, 5 and more units, the amount of buyers continue to weed themselves out. And maybe for some of the same reasons. There's certainly not a single family or a single person looking to live in one unit of a 50-unit apartment building, but they're going to buy the whole building so that they can live in one. So typically that's not the case. That's certainly an alternative. That certainly could be a smart decision depending on, again, your goals for you and your family. But a typical single family or single person is not going to buy a 5+ unit apartment building or a 25 or 30 unit apartment building, let alone more, just to live in one of the units. And even for the investor, acquiring or investing in a single family home versus, I'll use the same example, a 50 unit apartment building or complex, it's different. It certainly is different. It could look like a daunting task ahead of you. And it's not a daunting task necessarily if you're prepared, but you do have quite the task ahead of you to acquire such a structure or such a community. You can do it though. You just have to prepare and educate yourself, and you can do it. And even for the passive investor being the person who doesn't want to analyze, doesn't want to be a part of the business at all. They just want to invest their dollars as if they were investing in the stock market, but instead you invest in the alternative investment vehicle of real estate. You can invest in large apartment properties or communities or assets as well. In fact, if you do invest passively in such a manner, your dollars will likely end up in a larger community or asset such as 25, 50, 100 units or whatever, something beyond 5 units, well beyond 5 units. That's typically where your investment dollars will end up. So even if you want to invest passively, again, you don't want to be anywhere in the business, you don't want to be a part of it, you don't want to be hands-on the business, you don't want to analyze, you still should educate yourself. So you're still in the right place here so that you can understand how it works. How do you acquire such a property? How do you acquire such an asset? How do you analyze an asset? How do you understand if it's a good opportunity or a bad opportunity, or what makes a not good opportunity become a great opportunity. So you're in the right place to understand that. And it's important to understand that whether you invest with myself here at Neely Realty or elsewhere, it's good to be prepared so you can adequately understand what you're investing in. I said if you invest passively, your dollars are mostly going to go into a larger apartment asset. So why is that? Well, one reason is because a larger asset has more income, so there's more income to share with potential investors. But the other reason is because of how multifamily apartments, 5 units or more, are valued. You see, as a single-family home and multifamily apartments had their values based on sales comparison or the sales comparison approach, multifamily apartments, 5 units to infinity or 5 units and beyond, are based on the income approach. The income approach means the investor or the owner has great control over the value of the property. The income approach means that the value of the property is based on the income versus expenses, or the difference between the two, known as net operating income. It's how many businesses outside of real estate are valued as well. Where the sales comparison valuing approach was based on surrounding properties and what they were sold for and purchased for, the income approach has very little to do with surrounding properties. In fact, the homes or the buildings or the apartment buildings around your 5+ unit apartment building could be vacant and ran down, but if you can keep your tenants happy and they're paying fair market rent, the value of your property may not be affected at all, because the income and your expenses of your property are what matter. Again, the difference between the two, known as net operating income. Of course, it's a risk to invest in anything in a potentially rundown area, but just know that your 5+ unit apartment building, the value of it is strongly controlled by the investor. And that's what makes the multifamily 5+ unit apartment building a pretty safe place for investors, because the value of the property is not so much influenced by what's going on around it. I certainly don't want the investment of my hard-earned dollars influenced negatively by something that is totally outside of what I'm investing in, like what the property is doing next door or the houses around the corner or anything like that. I don't want that affecting my investment, and you shouldn't either. So net operating income is an important business metric when it comes to certain types of real estate investments or certain types of real estate assets specifically. And we're going to dive into it much deeper with the basic math and the detail behind it in a future show specifically on analyzing real estate assets. In single-family homes and multifamily apartment buildings 2 to 4 units, I spoke on each in regards to risk. In a single-family home, when a single tenant leaves, all of the income for that property go away. They decrease to zero, and the expenses are moved over to the investor or owner or the reserves that they should have set aside. With 2 to 4 units, there's less risk because you have more tenants or more units that are paying income or providing income to you, which covers the expenses of the property, such as utilities, if there are any for the owner or investor, or mortgage, or whatever maintenance and such expenses that might be applicable to the property. As we go into larger apartment assets, the risk is spread even more. Keeping to the 50-unit apartment example, if one tenant was to leave, or maybe 2 or 3, of course you want those units made ready for new tenants immediately or as soon as possible, but you still have a great amount of income for the remaining 47, 48, 49 tenants that are still occupying the apartment homes. And that income should cover all of the expenses, putting no liability on and lowering the risk to the investor or investors. Wow, time really does fly. In this show, we talked about residential property asset types and what to look for in them. I was breaking it down into 5 W's: who, what, why, when, and where. So we talked about why, and we talked about what here most recently, but we still haven't got into where and who and when, and there may even be a how, like how do I get started or how do you get started? But don't let waiting to the next show or the next shows stop you from getting started today. Reach out to me. I'm at neelyrealty.com/engage. That's NILEEREALTY.com/engage. or you can find the link in the show notes. In the next show, we're going to talk about the where, the who, the when, and we're going to get to how to. And if this show was helpful to you, don't keep it a secret. Share it with someone else, and I'll see them and you back here next time, and we'll finish the rest together.
You have been listening to the It's Attainable Real Estate Investing Show, sharing transparent knowledge on investing and the powerful impact real estate investing can have on your wealth and lifestyle. Follow or subscribe to the show using your favorite podcast app so you'll know firsthand when a new show is released, or visit neelyrealty.com/podcast and see the show there. That's NILEE realty.com/podcast.